Let me know if you, all right, got it. Okay, can all of you see this?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to try to be a little bit more succinct than I was last time because I just kind of talked a lot. But so I wanted to continue in your education on the art history timeline. We're going to start hopefully where you left off with Baroque art. And then that lasts into the 1700s. And then after Baroque, we're going to look at Rococo, which is a fun thing to say, and Neoclassicism or Neoclassical. And they're very different from each other, very easy to recognize, I believe. Just trying to, okay, all right. Just a couple of things when I start thinking about art history, when I go into a museum and I look at something, I think about the art history timeline, which is the same as obviously a historical timeline. And where does this piece of art fit into that particular timeline? Then I think about like what country or area that it was created. Also, so many times, and you'll see today that art is a reaction to something that went on right before that particular creation of that piece. So I think about other artists or groups of artists or social or cultural event that possibly this art is like a response to. And then last, I also think about the artistic characteristics of the style or the period. And that's what we'll go over as well as just highlight some of the main players, if you want to say the main artists from these areas. So here on this timeline, just to give you an overview. So you guys probably, I think High Renaissance, I don't know if you touched into mannerism, it's a pretty short style, but most people are aware of High Renaissance and then Baroque. So we're starting here and then going up to the 1700s for Rococo and Neoclassicism. When I come back at actually next year, we'll be talking about Romanticism all the way up to Impressionism. So give you a little bit of an overview. So Baroque art, just giving you some general characteristics. It stems, actually the word Baroque is from an Italian word, which actually meant like a contorted idea. So once in a while you'll hear the word Baroque and it just means actually something kind of ugly. So it was kind of a derogatory term that was given to this time period by people, not of this time period, but the people that came after, which is really true of most art history movements, how they're named. Mainly, it rose as a style to promote the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation. It emphasizes faith in church, power in state, and that's especially in Italy. So you'll see a lot of grandeur, just like the slide says, decoration, contrasts of light and dark can be often very emotional, full of movement, tension, hidden sources of light, and different like textures. If you look at the different textures of the cloth and the things that you see in the image. So when you're looking at Baroque, of course, it happened all throughout Europe, and we're just talking about Western art history. But actually, hold on just a second, sorry about that. All right. My daughter. So the areas that we cover that are influenced, it would be these here, and each style had different dates and also different characteristics. So you can see here, we're going to talk about Italian and Flanders, which is the northern part of Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and then England and France. I'm not going to go over those, but those are definitely two areas that you would, want to investigate. But there's so much to the Baroque style. So the three Italian Baroque artists we're going to look at, Caravaggio, Bernini, and Artemisia Gentileschi. I'm trying to also pull some of the women into these different styles too that actually haven't really been known until actually the late 20th century. So a lot of art historians have gone back and picked up their stories. let's see, probably the most well-known is Caravaggio. That's actually the town that he was from. Michelangelo Merisi here would be his full name, but they just they just call him Caravaggio. Bernini was 27 years actually younger than he was, and Gentileschi, like I said, had practically been forgotten until the late 20th century. So a couple of my favorites, these are really large, and pay attention to the size of the images as well, because we go from huge to very small. Caravaggio actually was a character. He was very arrogant, rebellious. He ended up actually murdering somebody over a bet, over a tennis match, which sounds weird, but apparently that was something that was played during that time period. And his life actually was short. He was banned from Rome, and then supposedly had a pardon, was coming back, and then died in transit. But his paintings are incredibly dramatic. So I think when you think of Baroque, that you can think of him as probably the key person or artist. They were controversial, but his paintings were popular, and they were influential for many generations of painters all over Europe. So at 21 years old, he moved from Caravaggio to Rome. And his life was, I read some biographical material, but his life was pretty tough. He was selling images or like paintings of fruits and flowers on the street to get by. These two images are actually in a small church in Piazza del Popolo, which is in Rome, which means the Piazza of the People. And they are next to each other, or not next to each other, across from each other in a small chapel. So when I had a chance to see them, I first went in to see this one because I loved the conversion on the way to Damascus, but then I turned around and I saw that one. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much there, and it's such a small area. So they were commissioned for the chapel in 1601. So if you see the size of these, 7 feet, 7 inches by almost, a little less than 6 feet. So he painted both of them. They're oil on a panel. And then they were both painted in 1601. So the one on the left is probably my favorite. This is Saul, who in the Bible becomes Paul, right? When he's actually converted to Christianity, and he was a Roman soldier. And so what Caravaggio did that I absolutely love is he took just people that were everyday models that he could find. Some of them were street people, whoever he could hire, and he put them in these paintings. So for the very first time, things were very realistic. Like if you look at this painting of the older gentleman that's holding his horse, like he's got varicose veins, and you could see his furrowed brow and stuff. But this was the point where Saul hears the voice of God, and then he actually falls from his horse and is converted at that point. And then the crucifixion of St. Peter, he's being crucified upside down, of course. And they're both extremely dramatic. One in, maybe a pleasanter form here with the conversion, obviously, versus being crucified. But you can just see the strength of the muscles and the detail and the light. But what's typical of Baroque is the idea that it's a very dark background. And again, Caravaggio had a way of showing characters that were pretty controversial, especially when you take, Christ-like figures or other people from religion, and then you're displaying them with common image, common people, and they're not, that well, they're not beautified, I guess is what I want to say. So he was very controversial. One of his followers actually is Artemisia. You may know her. She had a lot of success in early modern, what we consider modern Italy in the 1600s. But women at this time were not allowed to join any kind of artist workshops or academy. And she actually was trained by her father, which is true of a lot of women painters. The only way they became painters was the fact that they had their father to teach them. Unfortunately, he had somebody that worked in his studio that ended up attacking her, like trying to rape her, and that went to court, and it was a big fiasco. So she ended up moving from the area, eventually did get married. But if you notice, her painting is very similar to Caravaggio in that really strong light. She picks up a lot more women models and themes. Her father was friends with Caravaggio, and through that acquaintance introduced Artemisia to their that approach of rejecting tradition, of imitating artists in the high Renaissance. Let's see, what else can I tell you? So high Renaissance, or I'm sorry, Baroque artists often will have this really strong light source, but you don't really see where it's coming from, but it's very dramatic. And then again, the lifelike images. Hiring models was very expensive for women artists. They weren't allowed to, say, go into an academy that had life drawing studios. And so a lot of times actually getting women to sit for her was easier. So she left Rome, moved to Florence, and at this time she painted this particular painting of Mary Magdalene, which I absolutely love. I think I love the yellow, it's just gorgeous. But here she's shown as a young woman. This is like the point again of her conversion. So, all the points that they're picking up are very dramatic. She's young, she's kind of clutching herself, gazes outward, kind of overcome with emotion. Again, she is painted in a striking naturalism that was not apparent in other time periods before Baroque. And on, let's see, a little of the iconography here on the table right beside her is a mirror. And that was symbolic of the reflection of her past life and her readiness for virtue to be converted and to follow Christ. So when we look at her and Caravaggio next to each other, I think this is a really interesting comparison, but both of them painted Judith slaying Holofernes. Artemisia actually did it a couple different times at a couple different, it was pretty similar. Some of the colors change, but then you have Caravaggio on the left. So as far as size wise, hers is actually a little bit larger. Both the same emotional point of the story where Judith has gotten Holofernes drunk, and then so her and her maid come in and they're basically decapitating him. So interesting enough, especially with Caravaggio and her maid, Judith's maid, definitely an older woman, all wrinkled, if you look at her hands, and she's there helping her versus Artemisia. But both of them, Artemisia's maid is just a little younger, a little bit romanticized, I think, in a way. But you can see where there's strong light, deep shadows, and again, that high sense of drama with this brutal attack. Artemisia does a really good job of the diagonals she creates with the arms and the sword kind of pointing to the General Holofernes' head there. I think Caravaggio does that also in the same way, but it's a little bit more compact. But both of them are pretty gruesome. I think Artemisia has the blood spilling down, where Caravaggio is kind of highlighting this goriness a little bit more. All right, enough of that. Let's go into some prettier things. Bernini was an important scholar, our sculptor during this time period, and he was the leading figure of Roman architecture during the Baroque period. These are two of his most famous sculptures, Apollo and Daphne, which was created in 1625, and the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa right here. Actually, I set them in opposite order, but this one right here with the gold is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. So Bernini also studied under his father, who was an artist, but then Bernini kind of overtook his father, getting more commissions. He was very religious and influenced a lot by Greek and Roman architecture, or not architecture, but sculpture and marbles that he saw in the Vatican. He completed actually Apollo and Daphne when he was 27. So obviously they have, their lives were usually a number of decades shorter, hopefully, than our lives will be. But for that age, he was pretty competent when I think about what I was doing at 27. So what's happening with Daphne is she's being helped by the gods here. This is a mythological story where she's being chased by Apollo. And so the gods help her turn into a laurel tree to escape. So if you kind of see at the bottom of her feet and her, as her body twists dramatically, she's turning actually into a tree, and especially at the top there too. You can see the leaves and even the bark itself starting to form. So just so much drama in the angles of the bodies and the twisting of the fabrics as well. So the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, Bernini again chooses that most dramatic moment possible, and that's the ascension of Teresa into heaven. And this is the moment where actually the angel is piercing her breast, her heart with the love of God. So that's what he's illustrating here. And the moment is shown through all this whirling fabric, which is just amazing. It doesn't look like stone anymore, does it? It's just gorgeous. And then up at the top, you have these golden rods that are coming down, and there's actually a hidden window up there. So that makes it even more dramatic. So I think you sort of maybe get the feeling of Italian Baroque art, just very emotional, high drama. When we look at Flemish, and again, the northern part, or I'm sorry, the southern part of the Netherlands. And it sounds strange, but the Spanish at this time were controlling this area. But so Flemish is actually different from Dutch, and we'll look at the two. But what became popular were things like still life painting. And one of the most innovative artists for still life painting was this Jean Bruegel, the elder here, and his family. And then Peter Paul Rubens was more of a history painter. So they knew each other. Bruegel had 7 children, and then his wife and himself and the children all died in a cholera epidemic. Rubens actually took care of the children. He was their guardian, and they were very close friends. So that's why this has been painted by Rubens. So what's interesting is they work together, which I'll show you this in just a second. This is part of a triptych or a 3-paneled altarpiece that is religious, obviously, in nature. I'm just showing the center one here. But again, even though it's Flemish, you can still see those diagonals, the drama. You're getting a sense of strong contrast, but not that dramatic kind of hot light of the Italians here. Rubens really was the leading figure painter during the Flemish Baroque period, and he was very innovative with his style. So when you look at Bruegel the elder, because there is Bruegel the younger, who will come along soon, not in this presentation, but later. So he was very well versed in botanical renderings, such as this container or bouquet of flowers. And as you notice, like, he isolates every single flower. Really, when you kind of get in there, and it's hard for us because it's a little bit different maybe of what we're used to seeing today, but you definitely see irises and tulips and roses, things you can recognize. Flower pieces like this were traditionally actually symbolic with hidden meaning, basically meaning that, let's see, they were an interpretation of nature, but they also kind of represented death, because the flowers did not last that long. So there was a revelation basically during this time period that the flowers were really a reflection of the worldview, that nature was a revelation of God. So you get the undertones of religion there. But he puts in minor details: insects, butterflies, snails. He would go and seek out very rare flowers, often traveling away from the area. If they weren't available, he would make sketches of them. And then he used common blooms as well. The blooming flowers really would occur in different seasons. So he's definitely manipulated that and added them together, which would have been impossible to have them all blooming at the same time. So he's almost botanical, like very scientific in his renderings, very precise. What's interesting, though, is Bruegel, the elder, and Rubens, not only were they good friends, but they painted together. And I kind of remember going through this maybe like 30 years ago in my art history classes, but it was nice to like look this over, because I'd forgotten that they collaborated actually on 24 works altogether. And Bruegel was responsible for the still life elements. So in this image, the Garden of Eden with the fall of man, he would have done, Bruegel would have done like the menagerie of all the animals, all different types there, tigers and lions and peacocks, and just almost anything you can imagine is in there. And this was his interpretation of the Garden of Eden. He also did the landscape as well, so he's very versed in that. And then Rubens came in and painted the figures. So these are very, what they say, Ruben-esque, but he tends to use the same palette or the same colors in his figures. This one isn't as dramatically lit as the image of Christ. So and then there's also, oops, no, I thought I put another one in, but I didn't. So anyway, quite gorgeous. Let's see, anything else I want to tell you? Okay. Oh, and then one other thing that was interesting, it actually was painted in Dutch that Bruegel, he said he, in kind of abbreviated terms, painted the figures while, I'm sorry, Rubens painted the figures, and then Bruegel painted the rest. They just put work was one simple word. So they both signed these. So they both took credit for them. And they were commissioned by just citizens, probably wealthy citizens, obviously, and not by the church, but there's still a strong religious undertone in all of them, obviously. When you look at Dutch Baroque art, if you've heard of the Golden Age, the Dutch Golden Age, it lasted from the 1630s to the 1670s, and it is similar in many ways to the Flemish Baroque. The subjects, though, included portraiture, which is a little bit different than what the Flemish were painting. Group portraits were popular, still lifes, genre paintings, which means paintings of everyday life in landscape. Art in this area was mainly bought by the middle class and not the church. And just like in all the other Baroque paintings, light is important, but it's much more reserved compared to the other art that we were just looking at. So the three artists that we're going to study is Judith Lester, who again was kind of unknown to us, I think, as contemporary, like she wasn't really talked about until the late 1900s, like around 1980, there was a movement to really search for women, historical figures. And she was actually well known in the Dutch Republic. And then other two artists are Rembrandt, of course, and Vermeer. And I didn't put all of Rembrandt's self-portraits in there. In all these that I am showing you, the artists are self-portraits. Should have told you that earlier. But Rembrandt did over 80 self-portraits. So it's fascinating to look at those. I have a book of them, and it just starts from, when he was very young till up until like the year of his death. And you just get this amazing chronological, view of his life. And then Vermeer is known for interiors, and we'll look at his work. So Judith Lester painted this man offering money to a woman or the proposition. This painting was a little bit different, just that it had such a moment where it feels, makes the viewer feel very uncomfortable. First of all, if you notice the size here, it's only a little over about 11.5 inches by 9.5 inches. And as a painter, I know it would be really hard to get that amazing detail. Again, some stronger light here. So she actually was trained by different masters. For some reason, she kind of kept out of having any sort of romantic interludes with any of the other artists, and basically, you know, information about her training is scarce, but she was well respected. And actually her father wasn't an artist, he owned a brewery. So let's see, what else do I want to tell you? Okay, she was recorded. She actually had 3 students, which was very unusual. So she had her own studio that was functioning, and then she would have understudies basically, or people that would come in, young students. And she had 3 of them, which is quite unusual. And she was a member of the guild at the time, which would be similar to like a union. So everyone that was in the arts or even the trades belonged to a guild. But here, this older man in a fur hat, it's kind of creepy, touches her shoulder with one hand. And then he actually has a fistful of coins. It's sparsely lit. It seems very plain, and he kind of leers at her a bit, and it makes you seem, feel very uncomfortable, because you're like, okay, what transpires here? So that is very unusual in Dutch art, but it does look similar to interior scenes, but the theme itself. And then it's so small that it's really very intimate. You would have to look at this very close up. So when you compare it to something like the Night Watch from Rembrandt, which is amazingly large and was actually larger, I think a foot was chopped off of the bottom of it at one point, so it would fit on a wall much better. But you can tell, there's a huge difference versus her little intimate painting and then this large portrait. So all of these men are actually militiamen. And this was the point where the Netherlands was fighting for independence. And they actually weren't independent until 1648. And this was a group portrait, where each one of these gentlemen would have paid money to have the portrait painted. And so it's a large militia. Usually they had 200 members in it. And I think there's 120 men in every militia, and only 19 are included here. In today's dollars, it would have cost up to $6,000 to actually have the portrait painted. And I'm sure the captain who is here and his lieutenant here probably paid obviously the most. When you look at this, you can kind of tell, and I always show my students too, because they're all very ornate and detailed. But then you look at the guy back over here, over to the right, just his eyes are showing. I'm like, I wonder how much he paid versus these other guys. But there's all kinds of symbolism here. This is the moment where the captain gives the order to actually march to battle. Again, that strong contrast of light and dark that we've seen before, but the light falls mainly on the captain in black and that lieutenant on the gold. But you also see there's this female figure. And I used to wonder about that when I first was introduced to the painting, like, who is she? Because she looks like a girl, but she has a face of a woman. She was basically kind of not mythological, but sort of like a good luck sort of token, or an image, like some sort of symbolic image. And what's strange, if you look really close, she has a chicken tied on her waist, at her waist. And actually the claws were this part of the symbol of the militia. So what's unique about Rembrandt is when he was asked to paint this, usually painters at this time, just like thinking of photographs for a yearbook of a class, they were all in rows and everyone was seen about the same. But he mixed it up to where it was very dynamic. You get a lot of diagonals coming in through with like the gun and the flag and different, pieces of armory, the weapons that come in here. So you get a lot of diagonals that really bring your eye towards the center. And even though, the militia actually never did fight in a battle because they were probably rich enough to stay out of it. But, they wanted this portrait to honor them. And so it hung in their guild hall for quite a long time, and no one really paid much attention to it. And then it was moved in 1715, and about a foot of it was taken off so it would fit in the same guild hall, but a smaller wall. So they weren't, I don't know, weren't that taken with it, but now it's really the icon when you think of Dutch Baroque. And so Rembrandt, unfortunately, did not receive very much recognition during his life. His wife and his children passed away. He went bankrupt. He was very lonely and poor in his old age, but now obviously quite famous. One of my favorites, and I don't know why, because it's pretty gruesome, but the same idea here, the anatomy lesson here of the Dr. Tulip, I don't know how to say it, but I always want to say tulip because it looks like that. And I think of Dutch, but anyway, this is a guild of surgeons from Amsterdam, and they commissioned this group portrait. And strange enough, they had an annual public dissection, okay, once a year in the city. And this gentleman was basically in charge, the city anatomist, or basically probably ran the morgue. This figure was a criminal that had been executed earlier in the day, because there's written information about that as well. And then, so if you had enough money, you would go to these anatomy lessons, but quite in a very odd way to us today. They had food. It was like a gathering, a social thing. They had food and entertainment, and then they did the dissection. So what's strange about this to me, and I think it's a important painting, especially for Rembrandt, again, they're not lined up in a row. They're all in action kind of. But if you look at the gazes, so you have the two guys that are closest to the body, and they're actually kind of looking at the doctor's hand and maybe the tendons of the hand. And anatomically, that's actually very correct. So they've actually studied that, what was painted there. So they believe Rembrandt obviously looked at some dissections. But those two guys are kind of looking sort of past the doctor. Then you have the two to the left that are sort of looking at us or the audience, kind of over their shoulder. And then in the background, there's two other ones here, the two at the top, and they're looking at us as well. And then the doctor is like looking at one of them. So you get all these views, and it kind of, just by human nature, you look at the faces and you try to figure out where they're looking. So it's giving you a lot of implied diagonals. So it really brings like this dynamic movement around, very psychologically complex. Oh, and also one thing that was noted in history, and whether Rembrandt meant this, which I assume he probably did, but even though the dead man is a criminal, he is wrapped in this white cloth. And a lot of art historians have said that he evokes sort of a feeling of Christ's death. So I don't know, he's lacking some color there. His pallor is pretty bad, but I could kind of see that interpretation. Okay. And then I think one of everyone's favorite is Vermeer. There's not very many Vermeer paintings. He did not complete that many. It's pretty rare that you see any kind of exhibition where they have more than just a few together. But Vermeer was a Dutch Baroque painter, and his specialization was these interiors of middle-class life. And he was moderately successful at this. I mean, he wasn't extremely rich, but he supported his family. There's always a lot of talk about the different maids that he painted, whether they were his daughters or servants, or of course, some people like the girl with the pearl earring. They're like, who is she? You know, are they having a relationship? So there's a lot of that kind of speculation. But in this one, it's thought that Vermeer is paying tribute to the virtue of like purity, temperance, hard work. And so this is a milkmaid in a very plain room, and she is pouring milk into kind of this earthenware container on the table. In front of her are various types of bread. So you can see that she's been maybe baking or collecting those and maybe ready to serve them. But she's very sturdy. She's young. She's, you know, her sleeves are pushed up. You can tell she works hard. Vermeer was very different from other painters during this time period because of the different pigments that he used. So if you look in a lot of his paintings, you get this beautiful blue color. And so he's actually getting those from his palette is not really from the most is from the most expensive items. So like the lapis lazuli, I never had to say that, lazuli, would have been the most expensive, which he used that a lot. That's a stone once in a while you still see today, instead of like the ultramarines sometimes were expensive as well. But azurite was another one where painters would use a different pigment that was cheaper. So his work, people paid, you know, for these pigments to be used. And so the light, I think, is talked about a lot. And then just even though it's not a bright, dramatic light, it's you can see the light source, and it's casting this, you know, kind of beautiful glow across the items, the still life, and all the detail. And the blue in her kind of apron and the piece of fabric on the table is quite brilliant in color. So I like these. They're very quiet. I had to show you another one, of course, right? This one, the woman holding a balance, they've actually looked at this extremely close, and people thought she was weighing out gold or possibly pearls, because you see pearls that have been kind of spilling out of that box. But apparently there is nothing in the balance. So it's really kind of another moral narrative like the other one, where she's actually comparing, you know, material concerns against spiritual ones is the thought. But again, set up very similar to the other painting. On the left, you have the light source, not as strong as Italian, but still, you know, you can tell it's kind of overcast, but still enough light to really highlight the figure. Again, expensive pigments, and there's always a very delicate feel to his work. And if you're able to see up close, which I hope, I keep trying to pick slides that are really clear, but there's so much detail, like in the painting behind her and underneath, like the table legs and that sort of thing. So it gives you a real feel of what Dutch life would have been like at that point. And then our last area for Baroque art is Spanish. And the only person I'm going to show you today is Velázquez. And he was a leading artist of the Spanish Baroque art. He, along with other artists, combined kind of an acute sense of observation. So that's a big characteristic of their particular style. And they used a lot of earth colors in their palette. So here is an example of that. This is one of his earlier works, and this is the water cellar of Seville. So it's in an area that's very dry, and they actually did have water cellars, and the man would pour you water. If you notice, no one really gazes at each other. They're from different parts of society. You can kind of see that with his tattered clothes versus the young man's what looks like more expensive. In the background, you see a very slight figure, a middle-aged man who's actually drinking water as well. And so it's interesting that he put the three different ages of these men together. But I love to look at the ceramic pot, the earthenware, and the detail there. And you can even tell, it's not been made completely perfectly, and you can tell all the imperfections in the glaze. But a very stronger sense of light if you compare this to the Dutch. Velázquez, this is probably his most famous painting. He actually served in courts, and he was the official painter in 1623. So this would have been quite a bit after. Go here. So he actually created a lot of portraits of the royal family. And this one is particularly noted because of its technical brilliance and the way that he set up the composition. So the title translates into Ladies in Waiting. And the painting was really a turning point for the way that Velázquez broke from stiff family portraits, a little bit kind of like the ones that we had seen, the Dutch paintings. So this is a extremely large canvas, again, 10.5 by almost a half by 9 feet. It shows Marguerite here, Teresa, who's this very expensively clothed child in the center, who's the princess, and the king's obviously daughter. And she's dressed in the splendor, of probably, very atypical for a 5-year-old, right? So she's been attended to by 2 ladies in waiting who are on her left and right. And then the court actually included small people, or dwarves, but small people that were actually important parts of the entourage for the princess. And they're over to the right. Okay, so if you see them, because they have adult faces, but more childlike bodies. So if you take in what's happening with the princess and her entourage, and I love the dog who's trying to sleep, but the little guy is putting his foot on his back there. But if you look over to the left, you have actually an image, a self-portrait of Velázquez, who's painting this really large canvas. And so if you start looking at this and thinking about what's going on, they're looking at you, first of all, and you're like, wait a minute, are they painting me or the audience, right? But then if you note directly behind the princess and her lady in waiting that's offering her a drink, you see a very, just kind of a slight, I don't know, it's not very detailed, I guess, just a blurred image. And that is the king and the queen themselves actually in the mirror. And so you finally figure out like that is who Velázquez is painting. The guy that is to the right in the door holding back the cloth, he actually is a cousin of Velázquez, and he actually works in the court. He takes care of the tapestries, is his particular role. And then you have some onlookers to the right of him. I know there's one of them is a bodyguard to the far right, and then just another lady in waiting. So the blurred reflection is interesting because the king and the queen, this was his second wife. His first wife passed away. He actually fathered 10 children, but only 2 of them lived. But they didn't get along very well. So they think this is one of the very few times that the king and the queen are shown together. But again, it has that lighting, that dramatic lighting. This one is not as shallow in space as the other paintings that we saw. There's much more depth to it, but it's very enlightening to show how the court kind of conducts itself, what it would have been like if the king and queen were there. And the daughter looks like she's almost being painted, but yet she is really just looking at her parents. So Oh, one other thing too, Velázquez wanted to be part of he wanted to be knighted by the king. And if you notice on his chest, he has like a red cross. And that was a symbol of being knighted. And there was some speculation that was painted later because he probably wasn't knighted until maybe even this year or the year after it was painted. But now they've really looked at the history of this and they realized that he knew he was going to be knighted, and then he actually ended up dying after he painted this, but he did paint the cross on himself. So it was kind of a way to brag about himself, if you want to say. Okay, enough of that. Baroque. Let's go to Rococo. Funny name again, 1700 to 1780. And remember at the beginning, I said that most art is a reaction to what came before. And that's exactly what the Rococo style is. It was part of interior design. It existed within palaces and clothing as well as art, also music as well. Rococo was a French word derived from that meant like an elaborate pearl or some sort of really embellished decorative effect. The paintings that became signature to the era were created in celebration of these grandiose ideals of these people. So Watteau is probably the one on the left is the one that is most well known. And then Lebrun, I went ahead and put her in here. She's a little bit more towards neoclassical, but she also painted during the Rococo period. And then Fragonard over to your right. So the work during this time period was associated with aristocracy. Very different from what we were seeing really, with that strong dramatic lighting. At this time, people were in rich costumes. It was all about the elite, soft pastels. This really centered around clothing, like I said, and interior design. So figures were often painted in outdoor pastimes. And there was always sort of the sensual pleasure. Okay, and also a sense of theater and drama was included too. So let me show you an example. This is probably the most crowning piece of the Rococo. Watteau, he actually pioneered what's called the courtship painting. So if you look very closely to the women and the men there, they're all in couples. And it's sort of kind of a theatrical approach to how to show this story. Okay, so it's a mythological place that they're embarking to. This would have been a lot of obviously rich people, but they weren't not necessarily with their married spouse, if you sort of get my drift there. They would be very dressed up or wearing costumes. This kind of work actually appealed to private citizens, and a lot of times they would buy these and they would put them in small rooms in their house, in their homes, their palaces probably, and they would only show them because they were kind of sensual basically, and they would only show them to certain people. So this courtship painting really launched the Rococo movement. So it's this sort of misty melting landscape in the painting. He is looking at sort of these courtly lovers in middle of this sensual, trip, basically. When I was younger, I could never understand this, but now as I'm getting older and I look at the whole style, it makes a little bit more sense. But I'm like, why are there a bunch of fancy people going to this, this island that is mythological? So when you look at the next one, this may make a little bit more sense. And most likely all the art teachers have seen this one, The Swing by Fragonard. So this really explained it to me, I think, when I was trying to understand what was going on. First of all, it's very frivolous, like the other one. You have this young woman, and she's swinging. There's an older man to the right, kind of in the shadows of the tree, and he's actually pulling some sort of contraption, that kind of a levy that work the swing. But then you probably have noticed on the left, you have this younger man that is basically down there looking at her skirt. And so he's there for a reason, obviously. So he's like her lover, and whether that's her spouse on the right or what, it's unknown. But it was really scandalous when this was first unveiled. It has all these densely sort of layered sexual allusions kind of to it. Supposedly the figures weren't identifiable as specific people, but it was paid for, commissioned by let's see if I can get a patron that, let's see, what do I want to tell you here? Yeah, so he asked Fragonard to actually paint something of his mistress. And so this is what Fragonard came up with. And the patron again took it home and would only show it to certain people. So it's like a subverted social norm, right? And so there was a very large pursuit of personal pleasure and kind of decadence there. So Rococo is like a perfect title for it, because it just sounds very frivolous, doesn't it? When you look at Lebrun's work, she was a portrait painter, French as well. And she was known as kind of a Rococo painter, and then also neoclassical. The reason she's considered Rococo is because she painted, she was a court painter for Marie Antoinette. Okay, so before the French Revolution, and I would have been really upset as a French citizen, but it was, everybody, all the aristocracy were having a great time and spending all this money, and all the poor people were starving. Okay, so Lebrun, she actually made her claim painting Marie Antoinette, but she was on the list actually to go to the guillotine during the revolution. She escaped to London for a while, and then was able to come back to France. And then I know I'm almost running out of time here. I'm going to talk about the neoclassicism. So neoclassicism, and I've just got a couple to show you, is a strong reaction to that Rococo period. At this point, especially centered in France, you have to think that, they've gone through their war for independence. They're very in opposition of anything that's overly decorative, like the gaudy styles of Rococo and also the Baroque. And let's see, there was a general revival in classical thought that mirrored what was kind of going on with their political and social arenas at the time that led up to the French Revolution. So two of the artists to look at, one of them is probably the premier for neoclassicism. You would think of David here on the left. And then I also am bringing in Kaufman here, and she was a well-known painter during that time period too. Let me just give you some characteristics real quick. So it was in opposition to the gaudy styles, a moralizing message, expressing ideal virtues. So not as pastel colors, subdued colors were important, clear form. And they also picked up on a lot of the Greek and Roman architecture. They wanted art to be cerebral and not sensual. So here is probably one of the best examples. This is the Oath of the Haredi by David, a large history painting as well. He was probably one of the most influential neoclassical painters. And this was really the cornerstone of the idea of the French Revolution. But this is about a Roman family in whose three sons on the left are actually going into battle. They're dressed for battle and they're pledging allegiance toward their father. But the people that they're going to go fight actually are also distant family members. Okay, so it's like brother has to fight brother. The women on the right know both sides of the family basically, and are completely torn up with grief. Okay, and so, you know, they're just like, so basically upset by this. So the idea was with the French Revolution that, you know, you may have to fight your brother just depending on what side you are. Okay, so it had that moral overtone. But when you look at it, it has that very classical architecture with the rounded arches in the back. And this really just became the metaphor really of the idea of killing family for the greater good. And then I'll show you one last one. This is another one by David. This is The Death of Marat. And this is actually, he was a revolutionary, like a rebel, a leader. He had been in the sewers trying to escape police so much that he had this horrible skin disease, and he would sit in a medicated bath. And so a woman had showed up, had sent a letter to him, a message to him, which he actually has in his hand, and you can read it. But basically, she gains entrance into his bathing area. And if you notice on the floor is like a very bloody knife. So it's really more of a memorial to this leader of following his assassination. And this was in 1793. So, you know, he's very humble, his bath and his box, you know, very simple. Yeah, and then it's interesting in the 20th century, Picasso and several other artists actually pick up on this theme. And I do have to show you one more, I'm sorry. This is Angelique Kaufman, and she is the last one I'm going to show you, neoclassical. She was born into an artistic family, so her father was able to train her, but she far outstretched or exceeded her father in ability. She became very well known during her time period. Again, was a person that was lost to history and then kind of refound in the late 1900s. They were criticized, her paintings, because they often showed women that were in kind of not power, but like stories about women a lot more than manly strength, I guess is what I want to say. And she was a history painter, which was quite unusual for women. And she also understood the art market quite well and sold a lot of paintings, but this was commissioned. And it seems strange because it's a self-portrait of her, and her mother was a musician, her father was an artist, and here she's trying to decide between the two because apparently she was very good at music as well as art. And if you look in the background, again, that classical style of architecture's back there, and the classical feeling of the treatment of the landscape. So, but she's a person that, and this is another one of hers, and I won't go into the deep story here, but this is another classical painting of Kaufman's that is beautiful. Okay, how's that? And then I just had a couple here. We'll just show that for the video. So if you're looking for more information, just a couple of good examples to sources. All right.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Okay, you're welcome. I hope everybody has a great fall and Halloween, and I will see you next year in 2023.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You guys have any questions, anything you need? Anything
Oh, yeah, I forgot that part. I'm sorry. And I do have a couple, I have some chats here. I'm sorry, you guys. Okay. Is she pregnant? No, but that's actually a way that they showed fertility. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean when you look. So thanks for adding that in there too. So, okay. And thank you for thanking me. So I'll talk to you guys later if I can figure out how to get out of my Zoom thing here. So
Thank you, Heather. We look forward to next time.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Bye. I did just put the evaluation there in the chat for you guys to complete.
The evaluation says we need access, and it looks like it's a Google Doc, not a form.
Let's see. Oh, sorry, I gave you the wrong link. Too much multitasking.
No worries.
See if that gets it.
That's the right
Yep,
one.
that's the one.
Thank you all.